Welcome to the Housing Shift. I'm your host, Raj Rajendram. Before we get into today's episode, a quick word from our sponsor. Service Charge Pro is the platform helping housing providers fix messy, spreadsheet-based service charge processes. We built Service Charge Pro to make accuracy easier, compliance simpler, and to help rebuild resident trust. If you're in housing and service charges are a pain point, check out Service Charge Pro. Link in the comments below. Right, on to the episode. Okay, welcome to episode 4 of the Housing Shift. Episode 4 is called Designing Resident Services that Reflect Reality, Not Assumptions. And with me to talk about this really exciting topic today is Joe Williams. How you doing, Joe?
Good morning. Yes, hi Raj. I'm well, thank you. Very good. Thank you for
Great.
having me on.
No worries. Good to hear it. Really excited to have you on. So, Joe, before we get started, do you want to give everyone a little bit of a rundown of who you are and what you've been doing in housing?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Joe Williams, I'm Executive Director of Customer Services at Settle Group, housing association of about 10,000 homes based in predominantly the Hertfordshire area. Prior to working at Settle, I've been in the sector for 18 years now. Done a number of roles from frontline services. I was an officer working in the call centre through to what I'm doing today. Been fortunate enough to work at 3 great organisations: Richmond Housing, Poplar Harker, and as I've said, Settle Group. So there's a little bit of my backstory. Hopefully that helps set the context for what I'm going to come on to.
For sure, thanks. We should also mention, Joe, that when we first talked, we realised that we started out in housing in the same building, albeit working for you were at Richmond Housing. I was at what was then Thames Valley Housing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was about sort of 2007, 2008, and probably crossed paths then and gone our
Yeah.
separate ways, and here we are.
I think so. I'm pretty certain we played football against each other back in those days, but only if we knew now knew then what we know now, how much different it would be. The world has changed a lot, but yeah, those were good days in Premier House.
For sure, for sure. Awesome. So yeah, wanted to get stuck into the conversation. Obviously, when I reached out, I had just listened to your episode on the social housing roundtable, which is a great listen.
Thank you.
And yeah, what I want to sort of talk about today around these resident services that you've redesigned at Settle Group. So from my experience and from what I've seen across the sector, it seems like a lot of the services are designed based on assumptions. So, this is going to work for residents, or this has worked somewhere, and so it will definitely work here. We should do the same thing for all residents. And obviously, you did something different at Settle. Why did you come to that conclusion, or how did you come to that conclusion you need to do something different, and what convinced you all to go down that path?
Yeah, so it was a number of things really, and I think organisations when they're looking at service design or reviewing where they're at, the intentions will be pure. The drivers, in my experience, are always to improve resident satisfaction. I think what's sometimes missed is what's behind that, and there's a tendency sometimes to stick to traditional approaches. We've always done things a certain way, so let's keep it broadly in keeping with what we've got. With Settle, it kind of come about for a few different reasons, really. Our services were doing okay. They weren't in a place where we're having major issues, but we were starting to see increasing trends in dissatisfaction from residents. So when we looked at this was around the time the TSMs had just come in. So we had a very small pool of data from that. But predominantly it was complaints, feedback, it was visits we were doing out in the community, it was transactional surveys, and the themes that were coming through were we weren't responsive enough for housing services and we weren't present enough in communities. So we had that feedback coming from residents, and we used that to kind of open up a conversation with our voice of resident panel. So that's our resident group. And similar themes come out of it. In fact, they also recognised alongside the presence issue and the fact that the service was changing from where we would started, that also that the workload was quite imbalanced, which was an interesting point for residents to have picked up for colleagues. And that kind of led us to the second part, which was colleague satisfaction. So we had this resident feedback, which was starting to demonstrate some consistent themes. And then what colleagues were telling us was that workload was imbalanced, that they were going on leave or taking time out of the office and coming back to a significant amount of work, and that they were kind of struggling to almost switch off from that and feeling guilty. Some were saying about taking time off. So colleagues were feeling like it wasn't working as it could do. So you've then got the colleague feedback alongside the resident. And then the other thing, which I kind of phrase as the Holy Trinity, was our data. So when we started to dig into that a bit more, we found that the imbalance between like patch loads, workloads in patches was, well, the biggest to the smallest was double. So you had double the amount of demand. Now we had based it on a geographic amount, a geographic, geographic area, and a specific number of properties. But that isn't a good way of assessing the demand. 1,000 here and 1,000 there doesn't mean the same amount of work is broadly what I'm saying on that point. So we looked at that, and we considered some other data as well. We had a tenancy support service which was oversubscribed. We just couldn't get to cases quickly enough. We saw a difference in the time spent on casework between different teams, and that was a real contrast from different services. So the data was also telling us that we weren't working as efficiently or as effectively as we could do. And that led us as a collective thing to getting a survey out to residents asking about whether they wanted a specific point of contact, or was it about how quickly we could respond, and also how present we were in communities. And what we got back was that 91% of residents said it was about the pace of response as opposed to having my own housing officer, if you like. And 54% of residents said that we were present enough in communities, which is okay, but wasn't where we wanted to be. So it was a collection of all of those things that kind of led us to going, we can do something different here, we can do something better. And that really is what led us to taking a different slant and looking at a demand-led approach to housing services.
No, that's great. And I said to you before, and you call it the Holy Trinity. I think it's an apt description, but it's something that's missing in housing across a lot of areas, where the combination between that data, the voice of the resident, but then also the feedback from the colleagues, and really the lessons that I'm getting from the experience, or the project that you've had going on at Settle, is don't just rely on numbers or data, and don't ignore what people are saying. Can I ask, did you set out with the intention of capturing feedback from all those three different areas, or is that something that you figured out along the way? And how long did it take? How long did it take you to get to a place where you realised that this was the right approach?
I think what was interesting was actually that in my own mind, I thought there was an importance in continuing to review the approach, but I didn't realise just how quickly I would see things differently. So what I mean by that is that when we started to set out the design and the plans, and we entered into consultation with colleagues, and we started going out to residents, we had an idea of what the model was going to be. But what I came to understand was actually, and this was a real big lesson for me, is that your frontline services can help you shape some of the more specific parts of the model. So for example, we didn't realise just how much kind of coordination of the work was required, so we increased the resource as a result of feedback that colleagues gave us. Probably the bigger change was that, in my mind, the shift we were making was from a kind of patch-based model to a demand-led one. So work comes in, we have the coordinators allocating that work, and in my mind it was a team across the 10,000 homes. What came through in the feedback and the engagement with colleagues was, give us three big areas, and there's a fourth area which is where we've got lower demand, but for the purposes of this it's the three main areas that I'm referring to, and let us lead the demand within that. So you had teams in three of our most significant areas for demand. That allowed us to control the work a lot more effectively. It allowed us to engage with residents a lot more effectively, and as I'll come to, it's helped to improve satisfaction and resident feedback. That wasn't the view and the vision I had, and that's fine, because the experts are the people on the ground, and the experts are the residents. The same with when we went out to residents, we got ideas and we got feedback and suggestions to how the service can be improved. And actually, one of those ongoing conversations has been around how we provide services to older people. and how we do that differently. And some of the things we're looking at presently as to how we can be more effective in terms of responding to ongoing feedback. So what that led me to do was to make sure that for me and my teams and my director of housing, that we are regularly reviewing how that service is working. Part of what's really key to that is we hold sort of bi-monthly catch-ups with the directorate, where we give updates and hear feedback, and that's been really helpful in some proper nuggets of, have you considered this, or here's where the pressures are. So I think, and I've gone slightly around the houses, but to answer your question, it's an ongoing process of listening across the board. You've got your data as well, and that is a real key driver for me. As I kind of just mentioned, we've had all 12 of our perception surveys for our tenant satisfaction measures increase for 24-25 compared to the previous year. Trust and effort scores have increased over the last 2 years. We've seen a 1-point increase in our peak on engagement score with colleagues, which is wonderful, but the operational data is also just as important. So we've seen a more balanced workload, seen a 10% increase in contacts resolved within timescales. It's not perfect, and I'm not trying to suggest that everything is hunky-dory, because there's always challenges around resource and resident demand, but we're in a much better place to where we was a year ago and a year before that. And the only way that trajectory will continue is if we keep listening to those three sources: resident, colleague, and data. That's how we make a difference.
No, for sure. And it sounds like, you mentioned there about going around the houses, but actually, a big problem for me, to go on a bit of a tangent here, in housing is siloed working.
Yeah.
And actually having effective conversations across organizations where we know everyone's busy, we know everyone's got a service to deliver, but the services are connected.
Yeah.
And how do we have effective conversations and effective processes so that this information is shared, and we can all sort of work together to ensure that there's a streamlining in how things are delivered for residents. Joe, you talked there about a transition or a shift from patch-based resident services to more of a demand-led model, and you talked a bit about what that involves. But could you give us a bit of an overview as to exactly what that means and what that means for your colleagues and for your residents, please?
Yeah, sure. So demand-led for us is about responding to resident need and community preference. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. I'm not saying that for patch-based that's the case, but certainly with demand-led, it gives you that greater operational efficiency and a more tailored service. And what we found is the agility to move. So if I can just talk a little bit about the structuring of the teams. So as an example, we have 3 main areas, and within that we have our 4 neighbourhood partners. That group of people will respond to what comes through. We have a system, and our coordinators help to track and allocate the work, but it isn't as linear as that person's got 11 cases, this person's got 10, so they take the next one. That we will look at the time requirements. We have some data behind that to work out what's appropriate for being logged next, because there's a big difference between going to check on someone's garden versus a very complex noise case, which we know takes up a lot more time. So we have some science behind the allocation of the work, but the flex we have within that group is that, for example, if someone goes on leave and they've cleared their workload down, they won't come back to a ton of work, because the other 3 people in the team will pick that up. If there's sickness, we can shift resource, and actually it allows us to move across the 3 areas if there's extreme needs or requirements. So we work across as well as within the groups. One of the challenges we had quite early on with that approach was residents saying, well, if I've got 4 different points of reference, then I'm not going to know my local team, which was an understandable challenge. But conversely, we had some residents saying to us, well, my housing office has changed 3 times in the last 3 years. So there was that challenge as well. And part of what this has done is actually stabilise resource a bit more, because we've got happier colleagues and a more settled team. But just on that point, the team have been able to get out in the communities more. So even though we have 4 neighbourhood partners versus 1 neighbourhood officer, and again, just to be clear, they're working on a bigger area as 4 people compared to what 1 would. They've got to know the people as a team, and they've worked as a team. So we've helped to break down some of those barriers around, I only want to speak to 1 person, because actually, as long as you're getting a response and it's consistent, then it doesn't really matter who you're speaking to. And that team have been able to build meaningful relationships in the community. So when we say demand-led, there's I guess, a very practical example of how it works. And then alongside the demand-led services for neighbourhoods, we have a demand-led tenancy support provision, again, across the areas, and community safety as well. So an important distinction was we had an ASB team, and we have a community safety team now, and we've looked at a lot more of earlier prevention, to reduce the amount of enforcement we have to do. And when we do have to do enforcement, it's a last resort when it's required.
Thanks, Joe. As someone who's managed projects in the sector for years, that kind of really effective resource allocation is definitely ticking my boxes.
Yeah. And it's just on that. I mean, that we had, when we was introducing the model and looking at it, there was a lot of regulation, legislation coming through. You had the consumer standards, you had the better social housing bill, and a lot of this was about responding to resident need, but also pressures on the front line and how you allocate resources. We really thought about that angle of this and that importance of what regulation and legislation is telling us in terms of how we provided a model.
And you mentioned there briefly that that there's an assumption, I think, internally at housing providers, but based on a lot of resident feedback around having one point of contact and having someone, this maybe a sort of a traditional or old school or fairy tale model of, you've got a housing officer for life, and that's going to be your housing journey. And I found it interesting that actually what you alluded to there was that some of the residents that previously thought like that, so not just colleagues, had actually come round and said, well, this is okay because you're actually dealing with my queries and supporting me in the way that we need.
Yeah, and it wasn't an easy transition because we did have a lot of residents that were used to one point of reference, and that was more so where we'd had a long-standing neighbourhood officer, which is what we used to call them on that patch. But we had more patches that had a lot of changes than we did that didn't. And again, when we looked at the workload and the patch point, we had on average over 1,000 properties per neighbourhood officer. And one of the changes we made was around the retirement living resource, and that had 80 properties each. So you could see the difference in what were quite similar roles in certain respects and how much responsibility they had in terms of the numbers. So this has allowed us to balance that out a lot more as a result of the change. And I think by doing that, we've been able to kind of show residents that this actually can be better in the longer term. And that, as I said, is reflected in what we've got through TSMs and transactional feedback. And we continue to listen to that to try and improve it.
And you mentioned or alluded to earlier that at some point, your original vision for how this was going to work, I wouldn't say it didn't pan out, but you realised, okay, what we were trying to do isn't exactly what's needed. How important was it to essentially pivot a bit, and what helped yourselves to settle, pivot, and what helped, what structures were in place, what people were in place to help you, go through that process?
Sure. Yeah, I think it was a balance because we had, based on all the feedback data that we'd received, we had a structure and an idea for the model. So that was our starting place, and is broadly speaking been where we've continued. It's more the operations that has been shaped by the feedback. So as I said, some of the structuring of how the teams is set out has come from resident feedback. Some of it's come from colleague feedback, but we've really tried to listen to what we're being told and enact quite quickly. But that hasn't mean lots of extra money. We've used our budget, if you like, and our allocation of resource to change some of the ways in which we do things. So, for example, I mentioned a little bit earlier that we had a bit more feedback from our independent living schemes that we weren't getting out as much as was required or acting on feedback. So we've changed within our resource recently a role that's more tailored to start to engage and work with that. So the pivoting, if you like, was feedback from residents creating a service issue. It's not me going cap in hand to the rest of the executive team saying I need a new resource and more money. It's actually changing within our scope what we're going to do. So I guess the big lesson has been actually in how the teams work and the ability to be a bit more fluid and move and shift to kind of what demand is. We've worked within our means and changed how we work and made sure that balance and the data shows in the workload that we can make a change without it affecting and tipping over other areas of the service. So it's an iterative process, and I think we'll continue to try and listen and change and evolve. So yeah, evolution rather than revolution is kind of where we are with this at the moment. The caveat, of course, is you never know what's around the corner in housing. Regulation can change, pressures on the sector could change, the financial capacity we have can all change, all those things. So those are the kind of challenges we need to be aware of further down the track.
Absolutely. But it sounds like that what you're delivering isn't just a kind of, here's a new service, right, let's move on to the next thing. It is a practice of continuous improvement and putting yourself in a better position to be able to respond to anything that comes through in the future, because you'll have the structures and the people in place to move around them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the beauty for me has been the autonomy in this now. My director of housing and the service leads know that they can help to shape and craft what it's going to be. And that's the feedback comes up. And really, sometimes it's just a case of a conversation with me if it's within our budget means to help create that change. So that's the beauty of it, really, is that colleagues, I think, feel empowered, but also a big part in this is the data and the resident feedback, again using that to think about how we do things differently. And we are, as has been publicised, in the middle of merger at the moment, and again thinking creatively about services and how we can improve for residents the service we provide, the conversations we're having, which is really exciting to be able to think, well, how can we make this even better with the combined capacity of a large organisation as well.
So Joe, if we've got a housing provider or senior leaders in housing who are currently in a model of resident services that they'd like to change from, maybe it is based on just patches and it feels a bit outdated to them. It is obviously quite a big undertaking, but what are some practical steps for them to get started and start thinking about how to move?
I think the first thing to say is no model is perfect. It's about how you can improve and keep improving. But I'm not talking ill of a patch-based approach, because I've worked in a patch-based approach before and it's worked and it's been great. At this point in time, for Settle, what's right for us, we feel, is the demand-led approach we currently have. What the future looks like, I don't know. I wish I did, but every organisation will have its own drivers, its own key things to consider when it's looking at operational service design. I think what I can speak to is what I've already alluded to. It's looking at, first and foremost, is resident feedback and really interrogating that. It's not just TSMs, those are vital, but it's your transactional surveys, it's your complaints data, and it's what you get on the ground. Some residents' in-person feedback will be just as powerful as the numbers you see on a page. So you need the anecdotal and the data together to really shape and inform, I think, your views and that score. Data is probably the biggest thing that's changed in my 18 years in housing, how we use that now, and that's a massive tool of influence in terms of these processes. You've got a huge advantage compared to previous times when you can really scrutinise and look at that and use the data team or the business analytics team, if you've got one, to help to figure that out for you. And then, of course, colleague feedback. That's the bit I think sometimes is missed, and you don't want colleagues feeling like they're done too. And we've learned a lot throughout the last couple of years in trying to strike the right balance there, but making sure that we keep listening to colleagues is the key bit. And that's something I've had to, with all the demands that I have in my role, is making sure that I and my director of housing are still listening to colleagues and in terms of how the service is going. So I guess it really is those things. Models can change, and I suppose what I've learned from this process finally is that making that revolution, which we did, and then evolving the model over time, has worked quite well for us, rather than giving it 2 years and changing it all again. So that would be, I think, a consideration. But like I said at the beginning, it's about the right fit for the right organisation. There is no perfect model, but what's the best fit you can have?
Sound advice. And on to our last question then, Joe. So a tradition that we have on the podcast is to give you a magic wand, and ask, if you had a magic wand and could change something about how the sector designs resident services, what would that be?
I don't think we talk about our experiences enough. So this is going to sound quite broad, but it's about best practice. What I can reflect upon is the things that have worked for us and the things that haven't, and where we've got to today. It's not been a straight road. We've had to pivot, as you said, and change and listen and act. I mean, it's probably listening to that feedback that I mentioned from residents and colleagues in our data that's got us to that place. So I think it really is about us talking about the experiences we have when we change services. It's about engaging with peers, and I suppose if you're in a position where you're looking to, if you're considering changing the service, it's reaching out to people you know and hearing what their experiences are. But I think it's incumbent on leaders across the sector to vocalise a lot more their experiences with service change, because I really think that will help, and it certainly did with me in talking to others, understand how to engage, how to approach, and how you can learn from the things that have worked for others and the things that haven't. So yeah, talking more about best practice and lessons learned would be my ask of the sector for this.
Again, sounds like a great great bit of advice. Yeah, and hopefully off the back of this, people do reach out, because you're right, we do need to talk more as a sector, and we do need people to share success stories, and also, have the humility that you've all had at Settle in sort of reviewing what you've done, looking at the mistakes you've made, talking about them, and acting on them, and owning them.
Thank you. Yeah, and for anybody who hears this and does want to follow up, more than happy to have a conversation. Off the back of the round table, a few people engaged, and what was actually really good was I had a few residents contact me about what we delivered at Settle from other organisations. I think there's huge benefits in continuing to talk and continuing to listen to how we're doing things.
Sounds great. Joe, thank you for coming on today. Really enjoyed that chat.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you having me.
And yeah, we'll hopefully get you on in the near future again soon.
Would love to come back. Thank you, Rog. Much appreciated.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Catch you next time.
Thank you.